Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. Today's video, why the Soviets got to Berlin first. Today's video is brought to you by the Great Courses Plus. More on that later. It is spring 1945. The flowers are in bloom, the sun is shining, and the deadliest war in human history has entered its sixth and final year. At Allied Forward Headquarters, the Supreme Allied Commander of the Allied Forces, General Eisenhower, resists the appeals of his subordinates once again. After a heated argument, the two storm out of the room, leaving Eisenhower's mind unchanged. Many foresee imminent victory, but he's not so sure. It hadn't even been a year since the ill-fated Operation Market Garden, which had been stymied by a surprisingly resilient German army. No, he cannot justify the commitment of more manpower and equipment to the cause these men are championing. By the end of the Second World War, eagle-eyed spectators of world politics could sense that a new threat to global security was emerging: the Soviet Union. Although they had fought on the same side, tensions between the USSR and the US quickly escalated into a rivalry that would define the rest of the century. The post-war political landscape may have looked very differently if the Allies reached Berlin first. So why didn't they? The truth is, they didn't want to. They didn't even try. And with that said, thanks for watching. Okay, fine, there's slightly more to it than that. But before we go any further, let's mention a few things that do not explain why the Soviets got to Berlin first. Most of these misconceptions stem from the belief that underhanded political motivations were, in some way, shape, or form, the deciding factor. One theory asserts that Roosevelt had secretly promised Stalin both Berlin and Prague during the conference at Yalta. Eisenhower, who was supposedly aware of this, didn't want to commit the resources to capture a prize that would ultimately go to America's next geopolitical adversary. This theory is wrong. It's true that the Yalta Conference did produce the plan to divide Germany into different occupation zones, and that Berlin would be located in the Soviet zone. However, the Yalta Conference had also determined that the capital would, in turn, be divided into 4 occupation zones of its own. You might recognize that this is exactly what happened following the war, although the state of affairs didn't last very long. It has also been suggested that the Westerners held back their troops in the hope that the Germans would have time to suppress leftists living in Czechoslovakia before Germany collapsed. This is also wrong. As a matter of fact, the main source for this idea seems to be Soviet propaganda spread after the fact. So if not for political reasons, why did the Western Allies fail to get to Berlin first? In truth, it seems to have been a strategic military decision and not a universally popular one. It's worth noting here that the opinions among the top Allied commanders varied drastically at this stage. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was convinced that the European theater had been secured and that Allied hegemony was inevitable. He and the British command strongly favored a concentrated attack on Berlin, a death blow to the Nazi government. The somewhat less hubristic, but equally bold, George Patton believed that another large confrontation, while possible, could be avoided by striking quickly. But Eisenhower, the man who was ultimately in charge of making the decision, was, by far, the most skeptical of all of them about such a military maneuver. Like we mentioned before, Operation Market Garden, while not quite being the complete failure it's represented as in popular imagination, had proven that the Wehrmacht could still put up a staunch resistance. Indeed, if you've seen our video about the Battle of Berlin, you're probably aware that the troops garrisoning the capital were still more than capable of badly bloodying an invading force. And finally, the Battle of the Bulge had further stymied the Western Allies and crushed any dreams of easily rolling through the countryside while the Wehrmacht still had material support. Eisenhower reasoned that the fanatical soldiers, still loyal to the Nazi regime, would fight on even if the capital fell. Casualty projections for an assault approached 100,000 men lost in the pursuit of a dubiously valuable goal. Instead of investing in such a decisive and potentially very costly single thrust, Eisenhower chose to keep a wide front and focus on dividing up German forces still west of Berlin. Most notably, the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland, was still heavily defended as the Allies pushed east. Though German forces in this region were eventually surrounded, they represented a threat that had to be neutralized if the thought of taking Berlin was to be seriously entertained by Eisenhower. Additionally, there had been persistent rumors of a mysterious Alpine fortress in southern Germany, the supposed national redoubt of German high command. Allied commanders were so concerned about this that they dispatched an entire army to investigate. The Eagle's Nest, or Kellsteinhaus, one of Hitler's many headquarters, was actually located in the area of the supposed fortress, but it hardly fit the bill. Considering the Führer's distaste for the small installation, he rarely visited. It didn't even begin to approach the scale or significance that Allied intelligence had ascribed to it. All of these delays meant that the Soviets had a massive head start. When they crossed the Rhine in March, Montgomery's beachhead was 200 to 250 miles away, while Georgy Zhukov's Red Army had crossed the Oder River with 1 million men, some less than 40 miles from where Adolf Hitler was hiding. The subsequent invasion of Berlin turned out to be both long and brutal, but Eisenhower had no reason to think that he was better positioned. None of this necessarily means that Anglo-American forces couldn't have made it to Berlin. In fact, there were moments in mid-April when it seemed to be within reach. On the 11th, a US army was just 60 miles outside the city. Since the German forces were so heavily concentrated towards the east, his approach from the west might have actually been largely unopposed. Still, Eisenhower denied requests to continue to Berlin. His reasoning being that Hitler would simply divide his forces between the two fronts, allowing the Soviets, who at this point were hell-bent on revenge, to capture the city even sooner. At the end of the day, asking why the West lost the race to Berlin against the East presupposes that there was a race to begin with, which is extremely debatable. There was, however, something of a competition between Soviet generals to see who could reach the capital first. For his part, Eisenhower decided that a slow, strategic approach was preferable. Whether that choice was ultimately correct is up to the armchair generals out there. If you want to learn more about the race for Berlin, then I highly recommend you watch Professor Thomas Childer's series, World War II, A Military and Social History, which has an episode with that exact title. That lecture is only available on the website of today's sponsor, The Great Courses Plus. The Great Courses Plus is a subscription, on-demand learning service with some of the best lectures and courses from top Ivy League professors. By subscribing, you'll gain access to a massive library of over 11,000 video lectures about any major academic subject, like history, science, math, literature, music, philosophy, and more. Another one of my personal favorites is Professor Gary W. Gallagher's A History of the United States, which has an episode dedicated to the European theater during the Second World War. We invite you to start your free trial at The Great Courses Plus today by using my link, thegreatcoursesplus.com/thearmchairhistorian, or by clicking the link in the description below. By the way, I'd like to remind you that you guys can check out our brand new website, which, as you can see, has an ever-growing library. We're very pleased to announce that another big content creator, History Marsh, has joined the ranks of those bringing new and exclusive content to the table, completely ad and sponsorship free. If you'd like to sample what you'd get to see on the website from him, check out his channel, which you can find in the description below. He's got some great videos about ancient and medieval history that are as impressive visually as they are informative.
I got them horses in the back. My mother says a tag. The wood a lot of power when the horses are a tag.